The moment Ruth Rourke stood up in the middle of Harlow Creek's town council meeting and told Elijah Dalton that he was dead wrong, every jaw in the room dropped so hard that the sound of silence was almost louder than the crack of thunder rolling across the Wyoming sky outside. It was the autumn of 1882, and Harlow Creek was the kind of town that still believed men made decisions and women kept households. Nestled between the Wind River Range to the west and a stretch of open cattle country that seemed to go on forever to the east, the town was not large by any measure. It had a single main street lined with a general store, a livery stable, a physician's office, a small church painted white though the paint had begun to peel, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, and a handful of other establishments that barely kept the community breathing. But it was home to about 300 souls, and those souls had opinions, and those opinions had weight. And on that particular Tuesday evening in October, every one of those opinions was focused on the tall woman with copper-red hair who had just pushed back her chair and risen to her feet without being called upon. Ruth Rourke was 27 years old, and she had been living in Harlow Creek for 11 months, having arrived the previous November to take over her deceased uncle's small farm on the eastern edge of town. She was not from Wyoming originally. She had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had insisted that Ruth read every book she could lay her hands on, and she had done exactly that. She was sharp in a way that sometimes made people uncomfortable, possessed of a directness that the more polite residents of Harlow Creek had not quite gotten used to yet, and she had the kind of quiet confidence that came not from arrogance, but from a woman who had spent her entire life earning her right to take up space. She had dark green eyes that could go soft as summer grass or hard as flint, depending on the conversation, and she wore her hair pinned up most days, though strands of it were always escaping and curling around her face, in a way she had long given up fighting. She was tall for a woman of that era, and she wore practical clothing because she ran a farm by herself with the help of a hired hand named Old Percy Gaines, who was 63 and almost as stubborn as she was. She grew wheat and kept a vegetable garden and raised chickens, and had recently acquired 2 dairy cows, and she had made the farm profitable enough in less than a year that even the most skeptical men in town had quietly stopped expecting her to fail and pack up for somewhere more suitable. She did not attend town council meetings frequently. She had come to this one because the agenda had included a discussion about water rights along Shepherd's Creek, which ran along the northern border of her land, and she had a very specific and very informed opinion about what the council intended to do with those rights. Elijah Dalton, on the other hand, was someone who had been attending town council meetings for years, and someone whose opinions carried considerable weight not because he bullied anyone into agreeing with him, though some people assumed that was how men like him operated, but because he was genuinely competent and had demonstrated it repeatedly and consistently since he had settled in Harlow Creek at the age of 23. He was 30 years old now, and he was the largest cattle rancher within 40 miles of town. His ranch, the Double D, spread across nearly 4,000 acres to the north and northwest of Harlow Creek, and he ran close to 800 head of cattle on it with a crew of 12 cowboys who respected him, because he worked harder than any of them and expected the same from himself that he expected from others. Elijah was a lean, broad-shouldered man with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that seemed permanently shadowed no matter how recently he had shaved. He had brown eyes that were warmer than his reputation suggested, and his reputation suggested someone serious and unyielding and not particularly interested in being contradicted. He was not unkind. He was simply a man who had built everything he owned with his own hands, and had learned through experience that softness in business was frequently a luxury that could not be afforded. He wore the same worn leather vest most days and a hat that had seen better years, and he sat at the front of the town council meetings because he had been elected to serve on the council 3 years running, and he took that role with the same seriousness he brought to everything else. The issue at hand was Shepherd's Creek. The council, largely steered by Elijah's recommendation, had been discussing a plan to redirect a portion of the creek's flow to accommodate expanded irrigation for the cattle operations on the north side of town. On paper, the plan made sense. The cattle operations brought the most money into Harlow Creek's economy, and the summer had been dry, and the ranchers needed more reliable water access. The proposal was to build a small earthen dam and diversion channel that would redirect roughly a third of the creek's flow. The problem, which apparently nobody on the council had fully considered, was that Shepherd's Creek also fed a series of irrigation channels that served the smaller farming operations on the eastern side of town, including Ruth Rourke's land. The council chairman, a rotund and genial man named Harold Beecham who ran the general store, had been reading through the proposal and nodding along to Elijah's summary of the benefits when Ruth Rourke stood up. "That proposal will ruin 3 farms," she said, and her voice was clear and steady and carried across the meeting room, which was housed in the back of the church and smelled of candle wax and old wood, "including mine." The room had gone very quiet. There were perhaps 20 people in attendance, a mix of ranchers, merchants, and a few farmers, along with the 5 council members seated at the long table at the front. Several people turned to look at Ruth with expressions ranging from surprise to mild alarm. Women attended town meetings in Harlow Creek, but they did not typically interrupt them. Harold Beecham blinked and cleared his throat. "Now, Miss Rourke, if you have a concern you'd like to raise, the time for public comment will be." "I understand procedural courtesy, Mr. Beecham," Ruth said, "and I appreciate it. But since Mr. Dalton has just spent 10 minutes presenting figures that are incorrect, I think the efficient thing to do is to address that before the council votes on something that will cause genuine harm." Every eye in the room swung to Elijah Dalton. He had not moved. He sat at the council table with his forearms resting on the wood and his expression carefully neutral, though something had shifted slightly in his eyes, a sharpening, a focusing, the way a man's attention snaps into place when something genuinely unexpected happens. He looked at Ruth Rourke with the full weight of his attention, and after a moment he said, "My figures are not incorrect." "They are," Ruth said, without heat, without performance, simply stating a fact. "You've calculated the creek's average annual flow based on the measurements taken at the northern gauging point, which sits above the confluence with the Marner Spring. But the eastern irrigation channels draw from below that confluence. The effective flow to the eastern side is already 20% lower than the figure you're working with. If you redirect a third of that, the remaining flow to the east will be insufficient to support existing crops through a dry summer. I have measurements going back to March that demonstrate this, and I'm happy to share them with the council." The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence, the kind that occurs when a room full of people is simultaneously reassessing something they thought was settled. Elijah Dalton looked at Ruth Rourke for a long moment. There was something in the quality of that look that was hard to name precisely. It was not hostility, and it was not dismissal, and it was not the slightly patronizing patience that she had braced herself for without realizing she had been bracing herself. It was something more like genuine consideration, the look of a man who was actually listening. "Where did you take those measurements?" he asked. "At 3 points along the channel between the Marner confluence and the eastern fork," Ruth said. "On the 1st of every month since March, at the same time of day to control for daily variation." "You did that yourself?" "I did." Another pause. Elijah looked down at the papers in front of him, and Ruth watched him think, because it was visible when he thought. There was a quality of focused stillness that came over him like a man bracing against a wind. "Bring your measurements to the council," he said finally. "We'll review the proposal before any vote is taken." It was not the response she had expected. She had been prepared for resistance, for condescension, for the gentle but firm suggestion that she let the people who understood these things handle them. The straightforward acknowledgement caught her slightly off balance. "Thank you," she said, and sat down. Harold Beecham exhaled with the relief of a man who had narrowly avoided a much more difficult conversation, and the meeting moved on to other topics, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted in some way that was hard to define. Several people glanced at Ruth with expressions that had moved from surprise to something more like respect. A few glanced at Elijah with expressions that were harder to read. After the meeting concluded, when people were gathering their hats and coats and exchanging the slow, comfortable conversation that trails the end of any communal event, Elijah Dalton crossed the room and stopped in front of Ruth. He was taller than her by several inches, which was notable because she was not a small woman, and he carried himself with the particular unhurried deliberateness of a man who had never been in a hurry because he was always exactly where he intended to be. "I'd like to see those measurements," he said. "Not just for the council. I should have accounted for the Marner confluence in my own calculations. That was an error." Ruth looked at him carefully. "You're not angry," she said. It was not quite a question. No, he seemed mildly puzzled by the assumption. "I made a mistake. It would have been a costly one if it had passed. You prevented that. Why would I be angry?" She had several answers to that question, drawn from experience with other men in other rooms, but she kept them to herself. "I can have the measurements at the council office by Thursday," she said. "I'll come to you," he said. "It would be easier if I could see the channels themselves, not just the numbers." She studied him for a moment. The candlelight in the room was warm and unsteady, and it did strange things to people's faces, softening some and sharpening others. It was sharpening his, though not in an unkind way. It was revealing the lines around his eyes that came from squinting into sun and wind, and the set of his jaw that was resolute without being hard. "Friday morning," she said. "I start my morning work at sunrise, but I can break away around 8. 8 is fine," he said, and that was how it began, though neither of them knew it was beginning. Friday arrived with a bright cold sky the color of a robin's egg, and a frost on the ground that crunched under boots and sparkled in the early sun. Ruth was at the first measuring point along the eastern irrigation channel when Elijah arrived on horseback just past 8, riding a big sorrel mare that moved with the easy confidence of an animal well handled and well fed. He dismounted and tied the mare to a fence post and walked toward Ruth with his hands in his coat pockets and his hat pulled low against the wind. She had brought her logbook, a sturdy cloth-covered journal in which she had recorded her monthly measurements in careful columns with dates and times, and weather conditions noted in the margins. She showed him without preamble, flipping to March and working forward, explaining her methodology with the efficiency of someone who had thought it through carefully and did not need to embellish it. He listened. He did not interrupt except to ask precise, relevant questions, and his questions were good ones, the kind that showed he understood what she was measuring and why the methodology mattered. He crouched beside the channel at the second measuring point and looked at the water level and then at the surrounding geography with an expression of focused attention that was oddly comfortable to stand beside. "You're right," he said, standing. "The diversion as proposed would cause a problem for the eastern farms. I'll rework the numbers with the corrected flow data and see if there's a configuration that gives the northern operations more reliable access without drawing the eastern supply below a safe threshold." "Is that possible?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said, which she appreciated because it was honest. "But it's worth finding out before we build anything we can't take back." They walked the length of the channel together, which took the better part of 2 hours, and they talked about more than measurements. They talked about the dry summer and what it had cost various operations around town. They talked about the Marner Spring and where it originated in the hills to the northwest, and whether it was reliable year-round. They talked about soil conditions along the eastern fields and what crops fared best with the existing water supply. He asked her about the farm, and she told him about it without false modesty and without boasting, just the straightforward account of what she had done and what it had taken to do it. He listened to that too, with the same quality of attention he had given the measurements. She asked him about the double D, and he talked about it with a contained but genuine warmth that was at odds with the careful neutral expression he seemed to default to in more formal settings. He had bought the land when it was raw and unimproved, and had built the main house himself with help from 2 hired hands during the first winter. He had lost a significant portion of his first cattle herd to a disease that swept through the territory 3 years after he established the ranch, and had rebuilt from a position that would have broken most men, and had rebuilt it right. By the time they reached the end of the channel and turned back, the morning had advanced considerably, and the frost had melted, and the light had shifted to a softer midday gold, and Ruth was aware that the conversation had moved well beyond the practical business that had initiated it. She made coffee when they returned to the farmhouse, heating it on the iron stove that dominated the kitchen, and they sat at the rough-hewn kitchen table with the logbook open between them and the smell of wood smoke and coffee filling the small, warm room. Old Percy Gaines stuck his head in the back door at one point, looked at Elijah with the calculating appraisal of a man who had been hired to look out for someone's interests, gave a barely perceptible nod, and disappeared again. Elijah left around midday with the measurements he needed, and Ruth stood on the porch and watched him ride out toward the main road and then turned back to her afternoon work. She spent the rest of the day considerably more preoccupied than she usually was, which irritated her mildly because she had a great deal of work to do, and preoccupation was not useful to a woman who ran a farm. The revised water rights proposal came before the council 3 weeks later. Elijah had redesigned it entirely, working with a different diversion point further upstream, and a smaller channel that would provide the northern operations with an auxiliary water source in dry periods, without reducing the eastern flow below safe levels. He presented it with the same direct efficiency he brought to everything, and when he finished, he looked at Ruth across the room with a brief glance that was unreadable to most of the people present, but that she recognized as the simple acknowledgement of one person to another who had contributed to the same outcome. The proposal passed unanimously. Harold Beecham was visibly relieved. 2 Sundays after that, Elijah Dalton appeared at Ruth's farmhouse on a morning when she was not expecting company. She was in the chicken yard when she heard a horse on the road, and she looked up to see the sorrel mare turning in at her gate with Elijah aboard, carrying something wrapped in cloth across the front of his saddle. She came out of the chicken yard, latching the gate behind her, and walked toward the fence as he dismounted. "I wasn't sure you'd be here," he said, which was an unusual thing to say since she was almost always there. "Where else would I be?" she said. He seemed to consider this and then offered the cloth-wrapped package across the fence. "Mrs. Calloway at the general store had a delivery of books come in from Cheyenne. She said you'd been waiting on one of them." Ruth unwrapped the cloth and found 2 books, one of which was an agricultural text she had ordered in September, and the other of which she had not ordered and did not recognize. She turned it over and read the title on the spine, and it was a collection of essays by John Muir about the wilderness of the Western Territories. She looked up at him. "I only ordered the one. The other one I thought you might like," he said, with the careful casualness of a man attempting to be casual about something that is not quite casual. She looked at the Muir collection again and then back at him. The morning was cold and clear, with the kind of air that made everything look more precise than usual, every fence post sharp-edged, every shadow crisp. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked. "Yes," he said, with a promptness that suggested he had been hoping for exactly this invitation. That became a pattern over the weeks that followed. He found reasons to come by the farm, some practical and some less so, and she found reasons to be in town more often than her usual supply runs required, and they talked, and it was the kind of talking that is actually listening, the kind that builds something substantial between 2 people before either of them has fully acknowledged what is being built. He told her one evening in late November, when he had stayed for supper without anyone formally planning it, and they were sitting in front of the small fireplace in Ruth's parlor, with the wind doing something dramatic and bitter outside, that he had not had a real conversation with anyone in a long time. He said it plainly, without self-pity, as a simple statement of fact, and she understood what he meant by it because she had felt the same way for most of the 11 months she had lived in Harlow Creek. "People talk to you," she said, "but they talk to the ranch and the council seat and the reputation, not to you specifically." "Yes," he said, and looked at her across the firelight with those warm brown eyes that she had been telling herself for weeks were not particularly remarkable, which was becoming increasingly difficult to believe. Exactly that. She had been sitting across from him in her father's old armchair, the one she had shipped out from Missouri because she could not bring herself to leave it, and she was aware of the firelight and the smallness of the room, and the fact that the comfortable silence between them had shifted into something that required a decision. "Elijah," she said. "Ruth," he said, at the same moment. They both stopped, and then she laughed, which was not a thing she did frequently in a performative way but was genuine when it came, and it came now, and he smiled in response, the kind of smile that transformed his face entirely and suggested that the serious exterior was a habit and not the whole truth of him. "I like talking to you," she said. "That probably sounds simple." "It doesn't sound simple at all," he said. "It sounds like what I've been trying to figure out how to say for 6 weeks." Outside, the wind drove a wall of snow against the window with a sound like the whole world exhaling, and inside the fire crackled and the room was warm, and Ruth Rourke looked at Elijah Dalton and felt the particular vertigo of standing at the edge of something vast and good. "Then we're agreed," she said. "We're agreed," he said. He left that night well before it was improper, which was important in a town the size of Harlow Creek, where everyone knew everything about everyone within approximately 48 hours. But he stopped on the porch and held her gaze in the lantern light for a long moment that was its own kind of conversation. "I'll come Saturday," he said. "Come Saturday," she agreed. He came Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and the one after that as well, and December arrived in Harlow Creek with the full fury of a Wyoming winter, and the town hunkered down into itself the way it always did when the cold got serious, and the snow measured itself in feet rather than inches. Ruth's farm was manageable in winter because she had planned for it carefully, with enough firewood and enough feed for the animals and enough preserved food to see her through any stretch of bad weather. And Percy Gaines lived in the small cottage at the back of the property, so she was not entirely alone on the days when the snow made traveling into town impossible. It was one of those days, a particular Tuesday in mid-December when the temperature had dropped so severely that the air itself seemed to have crystallized, that Percy came to the back door looking more animated than he usually permitted himself to be. "Rider coming," he said, "from the northwest." Ruth went to the front window and looked out through the frosted glass and recognized the shape of the sorrel mare through the blowing snow even at distance. She felt something warm and embarrassingly immediate happen in her chest, and she turned away from the window before Percy could see her expression and added wood to the stove and put the coffee on. Elijah came through the door in a cloud of frozen air, his coat and hat plastered with snow, stamping his boots on the entry mat and pulling off his gloves with the deliberate focus of a man whose fingers had gone partially numb. "You rode out in this," Ruth said. It was not quite a question and not quite a scolding, somewhere between the two. "I wanted to see that you were all right," he said, as if this were an entirely normal explanation for riding several miles through a Wyoming blizzard. Ruth gave him the coffee and sat across from him at the kitchen table, and tried to maintain the expression of a sensible woman who was not particularly affected by people doing reckless things on her behalf, and she managed this for approximately 3 minutes before she said, "Elijah, you could have been seriously hurt. I know the land between here and the Double D well enough to ride it in most conditions," he said. "Most conditions," she said pointedly. "I'm here and I'm fine," he said, and looked at her with an expression that was both earnest and slightly defensive, the expression of a man who has done something impulsive and knows it, and is unwilling to fully apologize for it because some part of him believes it was right anyway. She looked at him for a long moment and then looked down at the table and then said, with a quietness that was not quite resignation, "Yes, you are." They spent the rest of that day in the warm kitchen talking and playing cards, which Ruth won 2 hands out of 3, because she was considerably more cunning at cards than her straightforward manner suggested. And when the weather showed no sign of improving by late afternoon, Elijah stayed for supper and then, in a household arrangement that was managed with careful propriety and the practical acceptance of winter realities on the frontier. Percy Gaines gave up his cottage for the night while Elijah took the spare room in the farmhouse, and Percy slept in the loft of the barn, which he declared was warmer than any room in any building he had ever occupied, which was probably not true but was gracious of him to say. In the morning, with the storm broken and the world outside white and still and breathtaking in the way that Wyoming after a major snowfall always was, Ruth made breakfast and they ate together in the early light with an ease that felt like something that had been there for much longer than it actually had, and Elijah looked across the table at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not careful, not measured, just open. "I have something I want to ask you," he said. She waited. "Would you be willing to come to the Double D for Christmas dinner?" he said. "The crew will be there. Mrs. Hadley cooks for us. She's been the ranch cook for 4 years, and she makes enough food for twice the number of people who are actually present." And he stopped, and Ruth could see him becoming aware that he was rambling, which he almost never did, and the awareness of it made something in him go still. "I'm asking if you would come," he said more simply. Ruth considered this. It was a significant invitation in the context of Harlow Creek society. Attending Christmas dinner at a man's ranch with his crew present was a statement of a kind, not a formal declaration but a public acknowledgement that something existed between two people that was worth acknowledging. "Yes," she said. "Be glad to come." The expression that crossed his face was not showy or dramatic, but it was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him. Simple relief and pleasure combined, and she filed that away as something to remember. Christmas at the Double D was nothing like what Ruth had been preparing herself for, which had been something somewhat austere and strictly functional, because she had mentally categorized Elijah as a man who organized his personal life the same way he organized everything else. Instead, the ranch house was genuinely warm and filled with the smell of roasting meat and wood smoke and pine boughs that someone had brought in from the hills and draped over the mantel. There were 12 cowboys seated around 2 long tables pushed together in the main room, ranging in age from a freckled young man named Thomas, who looked about 20, to a weathered veteran hand called Crow, who was somewhere past 50 and had arms like oak branches. They were boisterous and good-natured, and they treated Ruth with a combination of respect and curiosity that was more genuine than performative, and several of them thanked her with direct sincerity for saving the eastern water supply. "We've got 2 farms in our families that draw from that creek," said one of the younger hands, a quiet man named Decker who had said almost nothing else all evening. "My mother's brother has 40 acres on the east side. You kept that plan from going through, and I'm grateful to you." Ruth had not known this, and the knowledge of it sat warmly somewhere near her center for the rest of the evening. Mrs. Hadley was a compact, efficient woman of about 50 who had clearly decided to like Ruth approximately 30 seconds after meeting her, and demonstrated this by giving her the seat nearest the stove and a larger portion of the pie than anyone else received. After dinner, when the men had dispersed to various quiet corners of the ranch house and outside to the bunkhouse, and Mrs. Hadley had retired to her own room at the back of the house, Elijah and Ruth sat by the fireplace with a bottle of decent whiskey and the remains of 2 pieces of Christmas cake, and the quiet of the house settled around them like something that fit. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for asking," she said. He was looking at the fire, and she was watching his profile, the line of his jaw and the way the firelight moved in his eyes, and she was aware with the particular clarity that sometimes comes at the end of a long and full day that she was in serious danger of being very much in love with this man, and that the danger felt more like opportunity than threat. "Ruth," he said, still looking at the fire. "Yes." He turned to look at her, and the directness of it was startling because it was rare, this quality of looking at a person as though all the ordinary defenses have been put down without ceremony. "I know you've built something very good here entirely on your own," he said. "Your farm, your independence, your whole life in this place. I don't want to presume anything about what you want that to look like going forward." She waited because there was more. "But I am hoping very much that it might include me in some capacity," he said, "and I thought I should say so plainly rather than leaving it unsaid any longer." Ruth Rourke was a woman who had been on her own for a long time and had made peace with that, or believed she had, and who had been cautious with her heart, not out of fear exactly, but out of the practical wisdom of someone who understood the cost of being wrong about a person. She looked at Elijah Dalton, this serious and careful and genuinely good man who had listened to her at a town council meeting when no one else did, who had ridden through a blizzard to make sure she was all right, who had rebuilt a ranch from near ruin with nothing but his own determination, and she thought about what cautious wisdom actually required in this moment. "I'd like that very much," she said. "In whatever capacity we decide together that it should take." He reached across the small distance between them and took her hand, and held it, and they sat like that for a while, not speaking, while the fire burned low and the Wyoming winter pressed against the windows and held no power over the warmth inside. January and February passed in the way that Wyoming winters always passed, slowly, and with considerable testing of character. And Ruth and Elijah managed the distance between their properties with letters when weather made visiting impossible and visits when it did not. His letters were not long, but they were precise and genuine and sometimes contained things that he had not said aloud, observations about the world and about her that were written with a care that made her read them more than once, and then fold them and keep them in the drawer of her bedside table. Her letters back were longer, because she had more natural facility with words, and because she tended to think on paper in a way that was useful to her, and his responses to her letters showed that he had read them with the same quality of attention he brought to everything she said, picking up threads she had thought were tangential and following them somewhere interesting. In February, a difficulty arose that tested the comfortable trajectory they had found. A land dispute, which had been simmering on the western edge of the county for several months, came to a head in a manner that pulled Elijah away from Harlow Creek for the better part of 3 weeks. 2 competing claims to a parcel of grazing land had resulted in a formal legal proceeding in the county seat, and as the largest established rancher in the area, Elijah had been called to testify regarding established boundaries and historical usage patterns. He went because it was necessary and because it was right, and Ruth understood this completely, but the 3 weeks felt long in a way that surprised her with its sharpness. She kept herself busy, which was not difficult because February was a demanding month on any farm, but she was aware of the absence in a way that had physical texture to it. Percy, who was not an effusive man but was observant in the manner of someone who has spent 63 years paying attention, said to her one afternoon, while they were repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by a falling tree limb, "He'll be back directly." "I know that," Ruth said, driving a nail with perhaps more force than was strictly required. "Just pointing it out," Percy said mildly, and returned to his work, and Ruth made no further comment. Elijah returned in the 3rd week of February on a Wednesday afternoon, and she did not see him until the following day when he came to the farm with some wildly improbable bunch of dried winterberries that he had found at the edge of his property, and brought because they were the only thing approximating flowers available in February in Wyoming. which was a fact that made the gesture both absurd and completely sincere. She took the winterberries and put them in a ceramic jar on the kitchen windowsill and then turned around, and he was standing very close, closer than he usually stood, and she looked up at him and he said quietly, "I missed you considerably." And then he kissed her, and it was the first time, and it was not tentative. It was the kiss of a man who had decided clearly and acted accordingly, and she kissed him back with equal clarity. Spring came to Harlow Creek with the particular extravagance of a Wyoming spring, sudden and vivid, and almost violent in its greenness after the long brown months, and Ruth's farm came alive with it. The wheat went in during the last week of April, and the vegetable garden was planted in early May, and the dairy cows produced abundantly, and the chickens were unreasonably enthusiastic about everything. And Ruth stood in the middle of the eastern field one morning in early May with the wind in her hair and the mountains still snow-capped to the west, and felt something that was essentially happiness in its most uncomplicated form. Elijah came by most weekends and occasionally on weekday evenings when the ranch work allowed it, and they had settled into a rhythm that felt natural and solid in the way that the things built slowly and honestly tend to feel. They still argued sometimes about practical things mostly. She disagreed with his approach to rotating cattle pastures and said so. He disagreed with her estimation of the weather patterns affecting planting schedules and said so. And these disagreements were conducted with the same quality of directness that had characterized their first exchange in the town council meeting, genuine engagement, without the need for one person to diminish the other. Ruth loved this about them. She had not been certain this was possible until she experienced it. The particular freedom of disagreeing with someone you care deeply about without any of it threatening the foundation. It was in May, on a Sunday that had been warm and golden, and had produced an excellent picnic on the bank of Shepherd's Creek, with a basket that Mrs. Hadley had apparently sent along with Elijah because she had appointed herself the unofficial supporter of the entire endeavor, that Elijah said something that changed the temperature of the afternoon. "I've been thinking," he said. They were sitting on the bank with their shoes off, and the creek running clear and quick beside them, and the cottonwoods overhead putting out their new leaves in that delicate early green that cottonwoods do in spring, and Ruth was leaning back on her palms and feeling the sun on her face. "Tell me," she said. He was quiet for a moment, which was how he organized his thoughts before saying something significant, and she had learned to wait without filling the silence. "My ranch is 4 miles from your farm," he said, "and your farm is yours entirely, built by you, and I have no interest in suggesting otherwise. But 4 miles is a distance that is becoming inconvenient to me in a way that is less practical and more." He stopped. Ruth opened one eye and looked at him sideways. "More what?" she said. He turned to look at her, sitting up with his elbows on his knees, and he looked at her with that directness that was still, after months, capable of producing the vertigo she had first felt by the fireplace last November. "More difficult," he said, "because I want to be where you are, all the time, not just on Sundays." Ruth sat up properly and looked at the creek for a moment and then back at him. "Elijah Dalton," she said, "are you trying to propose to me while sitting barefoot by a creek with no apparent preparation?" "Yes," he said, with the calm acknowledgement of a man who has assessed the situation accurately and owns the assessment. "I know it's not done properly. I know I should have spoken to." He stopped because there was no father or male guardian to speak to. Ruth had none. "I should have been more deliberate about this," he said. "Probably," she agreed. "But the fact is," he continued, and now there was something in his voice that was beneath the careful composure, something that was simply true and knew it was true, "that I love you, Ruth. I have loved you since roughly the second Friday of November when you showed me your measurement logbook, and I thought to myself that I had never met anyone like you in my life, and I was unlikely to meet anyone like you again." Ruth looked at him for a long time. The creek ran beside them. A bird called somewhere in the cottonwoods. The mountains were blue and white in the distance. "I love you too," she said, as though it were simple, which it was. "I have for quite some time. And yes, Elijah. Yes." He looked at her as though he were making sure he had heard correctly, and then something broke open in his expression that contained warmth that usually showed only in glimpses suddenly present fully and without qualification. He took her hands in both of his. His hands were rough and strong and warm, and holding them felt like holding something that was exactly the right size. "I'll do this properly," he said. "I'll come to you properly with a ring and with—" "You don't need a ring today," she said. "Today you just need to be here." So he was. They were married in September of 1883, 11 months after Ruth had stood up in a town council meeting and told a man he was wrong. The wedding was held at the white church with the peeling paint, which Harold Beecham had quietly organized a painting party for in July so that it looked considerably more dignified in time for the occasion. The Reverend Simmons, who was a small, precise man with steel-rimmed glasses and a genuine kindness beneath the formality, performed the ceremony in front of the entire population of Harlow Creek, or most of it, because Harlow Creek turned out for weddings with the enthusiasm of a community that understood they were participating in something that would become part of the town's story. Mrs. Hadley had made the wedding cake, a frankly extraordinary three-tiered construction that nobody was entirely sure how she had transported from the Double D to the church without incident. Percy Gaines sat in the front row looking deeply satisfied with the way things had turned out, wearing a suit that must have been 20 years old, but had been carefully preserved for exactly this sort of occasion. Ruth wore a dress she had made herself over the summer from fabric ordered from Cheyenne, a deep ivory color with a fitted bodice and sleeves that ended at her wrists, and she wore her hair up but allowed the curling strands around her face to do as they wished, because she had decided to stop fighting them years ago. She carried a small bunch of late summer wildflowers tied with a ribbon, and she walked to the front of the church with the particular composure of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing and is entirely glad of it. Elijah stood at the front of the church in the one good suit he owned, looking like a man who had been counted upon to handle difficult situations all his life, and was quietly aware that this was different. This was not difficult at all. This was in fact the easiest and most right thing he had ever stood in front of. When Ruth came down the aisle and stopped beside him and he looked at her, the expression on his face was something that several of the women in the congregation later described to each other with the slight emotional breathlessness of people who had witnessed something genuine. It was not complicated. It was simply a man looking at a woman he loved, completely. The ceremony was brief and sincere. When it was done, and the Reverend had said the words that made it true, and Elijah had kissed her in front of the whole assembled town, the sound the room made was the particular combination of applause and conversation that is the soundtrack of happiness when it is public and shared. The question of where they would live had been one they had worked through carefully over the preceding months, because it was not a simple question. Ruth's farm was hers, built with her own effort and representing her independence in a way that mattered to her profoundly. Elijah's ranch was his, built the same way and representing the same things. The solution they arrived at was characteristically practical and completely their own. They would live primarily at the Double D, which was larger and had more room for the life they were building together, but Ruth's farm would remain hers in the most complete sense. They hired an additional farmhand to assist Percy, and Ruth rode out to the farm 3 days a week to manage the operations herself, because it was her land and her work, and Elijah understood this without needing. It explained to him more than once. The farm continued to produce well, and the income from it was Ruth's entirely, which she and Elijah had settled on together after a very direct conversation about money and independence that had been slightly uncomfortable and completely necessary. The Double D itself underwent some changes that the crew accepted with the good humor of men who recognized that things were improving. The main house, which had always been more functional than comfortable, developed something that might be called character over the first months of Ruth's residence there. Books appeared on shelves that had previously held only ledgers. The kitchen became a place where more ambitious cooking happened, because Ruth had skills that Mrs. Hadley was delighted to encounter, and the two of them established an early and enthusiastic alliance. The parlor, which had contained 2 chairs and a cold fireplace before, acquired a reading lamp and a second bookshelf, and a rug that Ruth had found in the Mercantile in Cheyenne during the one trip they had taken together in the fall. Elijah watched the changes to his house with the quiet contentment of a man discovering that something he had built for function alone was capable of being considerably more than that, and occasionally caught himself standing in the doorway of a room that he had walked through 1,000 times before without looking at it now. They had their disagreements, because they were both people with strong minds and genuine opinions, and the disagreements followed the same pattern they always had, direct and honest and reaching resolution through the same mutual willingness to listen and reconsider that had defined them from the beginning. There was one disagreement in January of 1884 that was larger than most. It concerned the Whitmore family. The Whitmores were a family of homesteaders, a husband and wife named George and Letitia and their 4 children, who had settled on a small parcel of land on the western edge of the county the previous spring. They were not doing well. The land they had claimed was more difficult than they had understood, the soil thin and rocky, the water supply inadequate, and George Whitmore had been injured in a farming accident in the fall that had left him unable to work at full capacity through the winter. By January, they were in genuine distress. Ruth had heard about this from Mrs. Hadley, who had heard about it from the minister's wife, and she had gone to see the Whitmore family without telling Elijah because she had anticipated resistance and wanted to assess the situation herself before arguing about it. What she found at the Whitmore homestead was a family that was cold, underfed, and too proud to ask for the help they clearly needed. Letitia Whitmore was managing the household with the determined competence of someone running on very little, and the 4 children, ranging in age from 5 to 12, were thin in a way that had purpose behind their eyes, the determined brightness of children who have learned to adapt. Ruth came home and told Elijah what she had seen. "They need wood," she said. "They need food. They need someone to look at George's injury properly because Mrs. Whitmore says it's not healed right and she's afraid." Elijah was quiet for a moment. "I'll send Crow and Decker out with wood from our stores tomorrow," he said, "and I'll ask Doc Harrington to ride out and look at Whitmore's injury." "Thank you," Ruth said. And then, because she had been thinking about it since she left the Whitmore homestead and had arrived at a conclusion, she said, "I want to do more than that." He waited. "That land they're on is not good land for what they're trying to do with it," she said. "But I have 40 acres on the eastern side of my farm that I'm not currently using. Good soil, adequate water supply. If the Whitmores could farm that land for a fair percentage share of the yield, they would have something real to work with." Elijah looked at her carefully. "That's your land," he said. "Your decision." "I know it is," she said. "I'm telling you because I want you to know, not because I need your permission." He absorbed this with the considered attention he gave her always. "I think it's a generous and sensible idea," he said. "Do you want the crew to help them build a structure on that parcel? There's enough spare lumber from the fence work last fall." She had not expected that offer, and it moved something in her chest that she had to be careful about because she was in the middle of a practical conversation. "Yes," she said. "That would help very much." The Whitmore family accepted the offer, George Whitmore with the dignity of a proud man accepting help through gritted teeth and gratitude behind his eyes, Letitia Whitmore with open practical relief and a directness that Ruth immediately respected. Doc Harrington confirmed that George's injury had not healed properly and set it right, which was painful but necessary. And by spring George Whitmore was working again, and the arrangement on the eastern 40 acres was underway. By the end of the 1884 growing season, The Whitmores were not merely surviving but making real progress, and George Whitmore, whose pride had softened somewhat through the experience of being helped with grace by people who did not make him feel small for needing it, had become one of the more reliable voices on the Eastern farming community's informal council when water and land matters came up for discussion. Ruth's farm continued to grow. In the spring of 1884, she expanded the dairy operation, adding 2 more cows and building a proper small dairy outbuilding that Percy supervised the construction of with the satisfaction of a man given an interesting problem to solve. The income from milk and butter, sold regularly to the general store and to several households in town, added substantially to what the wheat already produced. The town of Harlow Creek was changing around them during these years, growing slowly in the way that western towns did when the surrounding land was productive, and the community had enough internal stability to build on. A second dry goods store opened in 1884. A schoolteacher arrived that fall, a young woman named Miss Clara Bright from Ohio, who was determined and slightly overwhelmed, and whom Ruth immediately befriended and occasionally had for Sunday dinner. The railroad spur that had been discussed for years as a possibility for connecting Harlow Creek more directly to the main line was surveyed in the spring of 1885, which sent the entire town into a sustained conversation about what it would mean for business and commerce. Elijah served on the committee that engaged with the railroad surveyors, and Ruth attended 2 of those meetings in her own capacity as a farm owner whose operations would be affected by expanded access to markets. At the second meeting, she asked a series of questions about the proposed freight rates that nobody else had thought to ask, and that turned out to be critically important. And she watched Elijah across the table watching her with that expression she knew very well by now. The look that was not surprise anymore because he had long since stopped being surprised by her competence, but was still, every time, something close to wonder. They had been married for close to 2 years when Ruth realized, on a morning in late February of 1885, that she was expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days, not out of uncertainty, but out of a kind of private holding of something precious before it became shared, the way you sometimes want to keep a piece of extraordinary news entirely your own for a little while before it becomes the world's as well. She told Elijah on a Saturday evening after supper, when they were sitting together in the parlor with the books they were respectively reading, and the lamp turned up against the early dark of a winter evening. She said his name, and he looked up from his book, and she told him. The look that crossed his face was something she had never seen before on anyone, not quite any of the individual things it contained, not the surprise or the joy or the slight terror or the deep, immediate love, but all of them together in a configuration that was entirely his own. He put down the book and came across the room and gathered her into his arms in the way he had of holding her that was careful of her and certain of her at the same time, and she felt him breathe once slowly, as though settling something very large into place inside himself. "Are you well?" he said against her hair. It was his first question, not about the child but about her, and she loved him for it. "I am very well," she said. "I am better than well." He pulled back enough to look at her face, and his expression was still doing that extraordinary complicated thing, and she put her hand against his jaw and he turned his face slightly into her palm. "We're going to need to think about the spare room," he said, which was so thoroughly him, this movement from the overwhelming emotion to the practical, that she laughed out loud. "Yes," she said, "we are." The spring of 1885 was the most beautiful one Ruth could remember, though she was aware she was probably not an entirely objective observer. She continued running her farm and managing her dairy operation, and attending to all the things that made up her working life, with appropriate adjustments as the months progressed, because she was not the kind of woman who retreated from her life on the grounds of expecting a child. And Doc Harrington, who was a sensible physician without romantic notions about female fragility, supported her approach with only the standard practical cautions. Elijah was attentive without being smothering, which was the precise right calibration, and one that had required exactly one conversation to establish. He rode with her to the farm 3 days a week, and did not comment on the work she was doing unless she asked his opinion, and he ensured that Percy had everything he needed to assist more heavily as the summer advanced. On a warm evening in August, he finished building a cradle. He had been working on it in the barn for 2 months, in the evenings after the ranch work was done, from wood that had come from one of the old cottonwoods that had fallen in a storm the previous winter. It was not a simple object. He had taken considerable care with the joinery and had smoothed every surface until it was gentle to the touch, and he had carved a small pattern of mountain ridges along the headboard, because Wyoming mountains were the landscape of their life together, and it seemed right. He brought it inside and set it in the spare room, which they had been preparing together over the preceding weeks, and Ruth stood in the doorway looking at it, and at him standing beside it with the careful expression of a man who is not certain his work is good enough. "Elijah," she said. "The joinery on the left side is slightly uneven," he said, examining it with a critical eye. "Elijah," she said again, and he looked at her. "It's perfect," she said. "It's absolutely perfect." He looked at her for a long moment and then looked at the cradle again, and something in his shoulders settled. "It'll do," he said, which for him was approximately equivalent to profound satisfaction. Their son was born in October of 1885, a healthy boy with Ruth's dark green eyes and Elijah's dark hair, who announced his arrival with a great deal of volume, and then settled quickly into a general air of calm assessment of his surroundings that made Percy Gaines, who visited the following day with the gravity of a man bearing tribute, observe that the child looked like he was already thinking about something. They named him Thomas James Dalton, Thomas for the young cowboy at the Double D who had been one of the first people Ruth had felt genuinely welcomed by in this town, and James for Ruth's father, the schoolteacher from Missouri who had taught his daughter that knowledge was not a thing to be ashamed of, regardless of who was watching. The autumn after Thomas's birth was one of the fullest Ruth had ever known, full in the good sense, the sense of a life with all its texture and weight and warmth present and accounted for. She managed her feeding schedule and her dairy operations simultaneously with the uncomplaining efficiency of a woman who has always been capable of more than the world expected. And Elijah managed his ranch and his council duties, and the business of learning to be a father with the same deliberate seriousness he brought to everything, which in this case manifested as a kind of awed carefulness around the child that was deeply endearing. He was good with the baby. This was not something she had known to expect or not expect, but it was true and evident from early on. The way Thomas quieted against his father's chest in the evenings when the cradle was not quite working. The way Elijah talked to him with calm seriousness, as though the child were a person whose intelligence deserved to be addressed directly, which Ruth supposed was fair since the child was clearly paying attention. Percy Gaines taught himself a lullaby from somewhere in his history, and sang it badly and persistently whenever he visited, which made Thomas look uncertain and Ruth look away to hide her amusement. Life in Harlow Creek continued to turn. The railroad spur was approved in the winter of 1885, and construction began the following spring, and by the fall of 1886 it was operational. The effect on the town was immediate and substantial. Markets that had previously been remote became accessible. Goods that had been scarce became available. New people arrived, some of them settling, some of them passing through on their way to somewhere further west, and the town that had numbered 300 souls when Ruth first arrived was approaching 500 by the end of 1886. This growth brought complications as well as opportunities, because it always did. Land values shifted. Tensions arose between established residents and newcomers over resource rights, water access again among them. The informal social order that had governed Harlow Creek's community life, when everyone knew everyone else, developed edges and uncertainties, as the population grew beyond the point where that was possible. Elijah continued to serve on the town council through this period and remained one of its most consistent voices, though his approach had evolved in ways that even he would not fully have been able to articulate to himself, but that Ruth could see clearly. He listened more than he had before. He asked more questions. He was more attentive to the voices in the room that were less loud or less established, which she knew had something to do with having married a woman who was herself one of those voices, and who had been correct when she used it. Ruth herself became more formally involved in the town's civic life during these years. She organized, in the spring of 1887, a meeting of the farming operations on the eastern side of town to create a more systematic approach to water management and shared irrigation infrastructure, so that any future changes to Shepherd's Creek or its tributaries would be considered with the full information picture available rather than the partial one that had nearly caused serious harm 5 years earlier. Elijah attended this meeting not as a council member, but as a rancher whose operations were adjacent to the affected area, and he sat in the back and listened and contributed precisely when he had something useful to say and was quiet when he did not. And Ruth managed the discussion with the same clarity and directness that had started everything between them. Afterward, walking to where their horses were tied, he said to her, "You should be on the council." She looked at him. "Women don't serve on the council," she said. "Women didn't interrupt the council either," he said, until one evening in October of 1882. She considered this. "Is that a suggestion?" "It's an observation," he said, and she could see he was being careful about the distinction, because this was her life and her decision, and he had never once lost sight of that. She did stand for election to the town council the following year, in 1888. It was a harder campaign than it should have been, because there were members of the Harlow Creek community who were not yet ready for this particular change, and they said so with varying degrees of directness. She was challenged at a public meeting by an older rancher named Henderson, who questioned whether a woman had sufficient understanding of commercial interests to represent them effectively, and she answered him with such precise and well-documented comprehensiveness that even the people who had arrived at the meeting, inclined in his direction, left it inclining in hers. She won the election by a margin that surprised people who had not been paying attention. The people who had been paying attention were not surprised at all. Her first vote as a council member was on a proposal to allocate funds for expanding the town school, which had outgrown its original building since Miss Clara Bright had arrived and done an excellent job of convincing parents that their children's education was worth prioritizing. The proposal passed 4 votes to 1, the dissenting vote being a rancher named Aldous Perry, who was generally opposed to spending money on anything that was not directly related to cattle. Thomas, who was 3 years old, spent these council evenings with Elijah at the ranch or at the farm with Percy, and seemed to find either arrangement acceptable so long as someone was providing him with appropriate food and the opportunity to investigate things, which was his consistent occupation. He was a serious child with considerable curiosity and a streak of absolute stubbornness that both his parents recognized as being present in equal measure in both of them, and had therefore presumably doubled in the combination. In the spring of 1889, Ruth discovered she was expecting again. She told Elijah on a Tuesday morning over coffee, which was apparently her preferred delivery method for significant news, given the pattern. He received it with the same extraordinary complicated expression she remembered from the first time, and then he smiled, which was still, even after 7 years of knowing him, capable of transforming his face entirely. "Thomas is going to be very interested in this," he said. "Thomas is going to be very opinionated about it," Ruth said. "That is completely predictable," Elijah agreed. Thomas's response when he was told, at a level of information appropriate for a 3-year-old, that there would be another person in the family, was a long considering silence, followed by the question of whether the new person would be capable of riding a horse. because he had recently become passionately invested in horses and was using this as his primary metric for evaluating things. Elijah explained that it would take some time before that capacity developed, and Thomas accepted this as a reasonable limitation and moved on. Wyoming had become a state in 1890, the 44th state admitted to the Union, and notably the first state to include women's suffrage in its constitution, which had been the case since territorial days, and which Ruth considered one of the more civilized things about the place, among many. Harlow Creek marked the statehood with a celebration in the town square that involved a great deal of the contents of the saloon being redistributed to the general population, in a spirit of democratic festivity. A speech by Harold Beecham that went on slightly longer than the occasion strictly required but was heartfelt, and a fireworks display organized by Crow, the veteran cowhand from the Double D, who turned out to have unexpected expertise in this area from a period of his life that he declined to elaborate upon. Ruth and Elijah stood in the crowd with Thomas between them, holding a hand each, watching the fireworks burst above the dark ridgeline of the mountains to the west, and she leaned slightly against his shoulder, and he leaned back without looking down, just the instinctive adjustment of two people who have become accustomed to occupying the same space. Their second child was born in December of 1889, a daughter with Elijah's brown eyes and Ruth's copper hair, who arrived with considerably less noise than Thomas had, and with an expression that Doc Harrington described, with the slight bewilderment of a man of science confronted with the genuinely ineffable, as knowing. They named her Elijah June Dalton. Elijah for no one in particular except that the name suited her, and June because she had been conceived in the brightness of a May morning, and June seemed to carry that light. Percy Gaines held Elijah on his first visit with the extreme and slightly comical care of a man carrying something he values beyond his ability to express it, and sang her the lullaby he had always sung badly, and Elijah looked up at him with the focused attention of someone listening to music for the first time and making up her mind about it. Thomas inspected his sister with the thoroughness of a 3-year-old scientist, and then announced that she was acceptable, which everyone present understood to be a significant endorsement. By the winter of 1890, the Dalton household at the Double D was a thoroughly inhabited thing. Ruth's bookshelves had long since overflowed their original boundaries, and books appeared throughout the house in the way that water fills available space. The kitchen was the center of the household, in the way that kitchens always become when the people who inhabit them genuinely like to gather, and Mrs. Hadley, who had remained at the Double D through all of this, and had become in the years a figure of such central importance to the household that her departure was simply not a concept anyone entertained, held that kitchen with the authority of a woman who knows her domain. The crew of the Double D had changed somewhat over the years. Young Thomas the cowhand, now in his late 20s, had risen to become Elijah's foreman, a position he occupied with quiet competence. Several of the original crew had moved on for various reasons, replaced by new hands, and Crow had eventually retired to a small property of his own at the edge of town, where he grew vegetables with such aggressive dedication that he regularly forced them upon anyone who came within reach. The ranch itself had grown. Elijah had purchased an adjacent parcel in 1887 that added another 1,000 acres and increased the cattle operation significantly. He managed the growth with the same careful judgment that had characterized everything he built, not fast, not reckless, but forward. On the evening of their 7th wedding anniversary, in September of 1890, they sat on the porch of the Double D as the day cooled into evening, and the sky went through the colors it always did in Wyoming, which were more colors than anywhere else Ruth had ever been. The oranges and pinks and deep purples that stacked above the mountains like something a painter would be embarrassed to claim as realistic. Thomas was inside with Mrs. Hadley, allegedly helping her do something involving bread dough, actually primarily creating a situation that would require cleanup. Eleanor was asleep in her cradle, which had been moved from the spare room into the main bedroom, because at 10 months she was still waking in the night, and Ruth had found the middle ground solution of having her close without being in the bed itself. The evening was very quiet except for the distant sound of cattle and the creek and the wind in the cottonwoods along the drive. 7 years, Elijah said, as though examining the number. 7 years, Ruth agreed. I have thought, he said, with the deliberateness that meant he had been thinking about it for some time, about what the October evening in 1882 would have looked like to someone watching from outside. A woman standing up in a room full of people and telling me I was wrong, and me not knowing yet that she was the best thing that had ever happened to me. Ruth looked at him in the last of the day's light. He was 40 now, which showed in the silver beginning at his temples and the deeper lines around his eyes, and he was more handsome at 40 than he had been at 30 because the seriousness that had seemed somewhat austere at 30 had settled into something that was simply strength, the kind that comes from having been tested and having held. You didn't fall for me that night, she said. I started to, he said simply. The rest followed. She reached over and took his hand, which was what they did habitually when they were sitting beside each other on this porch at the end of a day, a thing done so naturally it required no thought. His fingers closed around hers. We have built something very good, she said. We have, he said. Together. The winter of 1890 and the spring of 1891 brought another change, which arrived in the form of a letter from Letitia Whitmore. The Whitmore family had been farming Ruth's eastern 40 acres for 6 years by this point, and had done well enough with it that George Whitmore had been able to save a modest but meaningful sum. He wanted, the letter said in Letitia's careful handwriting, to purchase those 40 acres outright if Ruth was willing to consider it, because he wanted his children to grow up on land that was their family's own. Ruth read the letter twice and brought it to Elijah not for permission but for conversation, because she had learned that talking through significant decisions with someone who knew you well and thought clearly was a different thing from needing permission, and a worthwhile thing. What do you want to do? He asked. I want to sell them the land, she said. At a fair price, which is less than the current market value because the current market value reflects improvements they made to the land themselves, and it would not be right to charge them for that. He looked at her. That's going to be less than you could get if you sold it to someone else. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. It's the right thing, he said. I know, she said. She sold the Whitmores the 40 acres in the spring of 1891. At the fair adjusted price she had determined, and George Whitmore shook her hand afterward with both of his and could not quite speak, and Letitia Whitmore embraced her briskly and said, You are a good woman, Mrs. Dalton, and then became businesslike again immediately because that was how Letitia Whitmore managed the things that affected her deeply. Percy Gaines was 69 years old in 1891 and had begun, with considerable reluctance, to acknowledge that certain aspects of the farm work were harder than they had been. He would not have acknowledged this aloud to Ruth for any consideration, but she could see it, and she managed the transition carefully so that more of the heavier work fell to the additional hired hand, while Percy retained the supervisory and organizational role that his experience made him excellent at, and that protected his dignity precisely as much as it deserved to be protected. The farm was doing well. The dairy operation was her primary focus now, having expanded to 8 cows, and she supplied milk and butter and cheese to multiple establishments in town, and had arrangements with 2 of the larger ranches in the area. The wheat field had been reduced slightly in favor of the dairy expansion, a decision she had made based on careful analysis of which operation produced the better return for the labor investment, and which Percy had agreed with after examining the figures, which made it as close to unanimous as anything was ever likely to get in a business context with Percy. The spring of 1892 brought an unusually wet season that flooded portions of the lower-lying farms on the eastern side of town, a situation that tested the water management systems that Ruth's Farmers Cooperative had put in place and found them adequate, which was satisfying, and overwhelmed a few of the older drainage channels on properties that had not joined the cooperative, which was unfortunate, but served as a practical argument for broader participation in the coming year. Thomas Dalton was 6 years old in the spring of 1892 and had progressed from merely being interested in horses to being genuinely capable around them, which Elijah had guided patiently, and which had produced a child who was developing the particular quiet confidence around large animals that comes from having been taught to understand them rather than simply to control them. He was also developing opinions about everything, which meant family conversations had taken on an additional dimension. Eleanor, who was 2, had the focused observational quality that Doc Harrington had noted at her birth fully developed into a personality trait. She watched everything with an intentness that was slightly unnerving until you got used to it, and she spoke when she had something to say, which meant her speech was less frequent than Thomas's, but consistently more precise. Elijah found Eleanor somewhat more instinctively understandable than Thomas, Ruth thought, because she processed the world in a way that was closer to how he did. Thomas was more like Ruth, wide-ranging and direct and wanting to investigate everything. The crossing in their children of the things that were each of them made Ruth feel something she had no adequate word for, a kind of astonishment at the specific miracle of it. By the fall of 1892, Harlow Creek had a new school building, funded in part by the council allocation that Ruth's first vote had supported and built by a combination of community labor and hired skilled construction. Miss Clara Bright, who was no longer quite as young and no longer quite as overwhelmed, was its head teacher, and she had 2 younger teachers assisting her to manage the expanded enrollment. Thomas began attending school that fall and reported on the first day that it was interesting, but that Miss Bright moved through the arithmetic too slowly, which was a thing his mother understood deeply and from experience. That same fall, Elijah was elected to serve as the council chairman, replacing Harold Beecham, who had decided after many years that he was more interested in running his store than managing civic proceedings. Elijah accepted the role with the seriousness he brought to all responsibilities and the quiet understanding that he would do it better for everything he had learned in the past 10 years, including from the woman across the council table, who was now his wife and fellow council member, and who remained entirely willing to tell him when he was wrong, which she had done twice since taking her seat and had been correct both times. He had told her this, the being correct both times, on the evenings following each occasion, sitting on the porch with the sky doing its Wyoming thing, and she had said each time that she appreciated him saying so, and he had said each time that it was just the truth, and they had moved on because that was how they operated. 10 years after their wedding, in September of 1893, the town of Harlow Creek organized a fall fair that had become an annual institution. It was the best kind of community event, simultaneously practical and celebratory, with agricultural displays and competitions, and a community dinner and music in the evening that went later than most participants planned for, but not as late as the music itself wanted to go. Ruth entered her cheese in the agricultural competition and won the blue ribbon for the 3rd consecutive year, which she accepted with modest satisfaction, and Percy accepted on behalf of the dairy operation in general with rather more enthusiasm. Elijah entered his cattle and won the category he usually won, and was gracious about it in the way he was gracious about most things he was good at, which was to say, he simply moved on and paid attention to other people. Thomas, at 8 years old, entered the junior livestock category with the call he had been raising since spring and came in second, which produced a brief but intense private reaction that he managed admirably in public, and discussed at length that evening at home, with the analytical thoroughness of someone reviewing strategy for next year. Eleanor, at nearly 4, was more interested in the music than the competitions, and spent much of the evening attempting to dance to the fiddle playing in a manner that was enthusiastic and entirely her own, and that Elijah watched from his position beside Ruth with an expression of such undisguised delight that she put her hand on his arm, and he covered it with his without looking away from Eleanor. It was late in the evening of that fair, when the music had finally wound down, and the lanterns were burning low, and most people were making the slow, comfortable transition toward home, that Ruth and Elijah found themselves standing on the edge of the fairground, where the light from the remaining lanterns reached, but the dark of the open sky was directly overhead. And the sky was doing the thing it did in Wyoming on clear autumn nights, showing more stars than any human eye can fully account for. The way the universe uses the darkness of the high plains to make an argument about its own scale. Ruth leaned against Elijah, and he put his arm around her, and they stood quietly in the way they had learned over 10 years together was sometimes the most complete form of conversation. "I think about that council meeting," Ruth said. "I do too," he said. "I was so prepared to be dismissed," she said. "I had the measurements and the argument, and I had steeled myself for the likelihood that none of it would matter because of who was and was not expected to have useful things to say." "And then I listened," he said quietly. "And then you listened," she said. "I didn't know what to do with that." He was quiet for a moment, his arm steady and warm around her shoulders. "I didn't know what I was doing," he said. "I only knew that you were correct and that the correct thing was to say so. The rest," he paused, "the rest happened because of who you are." She tipped her head up to look at him, and the starlight was enough, in the way it always was, to see his face. "We happen because of who we both are," she said. "That is the version I prefer." He looked down at her with those warm brown eyes that had been steady and truthful for 11 years of knowing her, and he said, "That is also the true version." He kissed her there in the dark at the edge of the fairground with the stars overhead and the distant sound of Harlow Creek settling into its evening, and she kissed him back with all of the years they had built together and all of the years still ahead, which felt, from where they stood, like a country with no visible end. Thomas and Eleanor grew up on the Double D with the particular advantage of children raised between worlds, between the ranch and the farm, between their father's deliberate solidity and their mother's brilliant directness, between the open cattle country to the west and the cultivated fields to the east, between the world that Harlow Creek had been when their parents arrived and the world it was becoming. They grew up understanding water rights and cattle management, and the price of wheat and the importance of community, and how to read a measurement logbook, and how to listen before you speak, and how to speak clearly when you have something worth saying. Percy Gaines retired from active farm management in the spring of 1895, at the age of 73, having run his last full growing season with the same meticulous care he had brought to every season before it. Ruth organized a small supper for him that included Mrs. Hadley's cooking and the presence of the Double D crew and the Whitmore family and several other friends. And Percy sat at the head of the table with the dignity of a man whose work had been real and was known to have been real, and accepted the toast Elijah made in his honor with a gruff nod that everyone present understood as the deepest possible expression of his feeling. He did not go far. He moved into a small house on the edge of town that the community had helped him purchase at a price that reflected what was owed rather than what the market bore. And he continued to appear at the farm with great regularity to examine the operations and offer his opinions to the new farm manager, a solid, capable young man named Walter Sims, who had learned quickly to listen because Percy was almost always right. Ruth continued her work on the town council through the 1890s, and continued farming, and continued the dairy operation, and continued being a person who told the truth in rooms where the truth was sometimes inconvenient. And she built up around herself and around her family, and around the community of Harlow Creek, a kind of life that had the weight and texture of something made to last. In 1896, 13 years after they were married, Ruth and Elijah sat together in the doctor's office in Harlow Creek while Doc Harrington, who had grown considerably older and considerably no less competent, examined Ruth with his usual careful thoroughness, and then looked up at them both with an expression that combined professional satisfaction with genuine pleasure. "You're expecting again," he said. Elijah had not moved from his chair beside her. Ruth watched him receive this information, watched the extraordinary expression happen again, the same one from 1884 and 1889, and she thought about the fact that it had not diminished in any particular, that it was as full and as present as it had ever been. He looked at her. "3," he said. "3," she agreed. "Thomas is going to have extraordinary opinions about this," he said. "Thomas is 10 and has extraordinary opinions about everything," she said. He took her hand the way he always did, the way that required no thought and no ceremony, and she held it the way she always did. And outside the doctor's office window the town of Harlow Creek went about its Thursday morning in the late summer of 1896, ordinary and alive and entirely itself, which was a thing Ruth had come to understand was not ordinary at all, but the specific and irreplaceable shape of a life built well. Their third child was born in the spring of 1897, a second son with both of his parents' stubbornness apparent from the earliest possible moment, and Elijah's jaw and Ruth's green eyes, and a voice that carried across the whole house when he chose to use it. They named him William Robert Dalton, William for no particular reason except that it suited him, and Robert for the Reverend Simmons who had married them 15 years before, and who had continued to be a quiet and genuine presence in the community ever since, and who was touched by the honor in the way that genuinely good people are touched by recognition, with surprised gratitude rather than assumed entitlement. Thomas was 11 when William was born and took on his older brother responsibilities with a seriousness that made both his parents watch him sometimes with a private wonder at the person he was becoming. Eleanor, who was 7, approached the new baby with the same focused observation she brought to everything, and within 2 weeks had established a relationship of such particular quality that Mrs. Hadley said privately to Ruth that the girl would make an excellent scientist or a doctor, and that either option seemed to be available to the world she was growing up in. The Double D continued to flourish through the closing years of the century. Elijah's careful management had made it one of the most respected cattle operations in the territory, and his reputation was now complex and multifaceted in the way that the reputations of people who have lived fully tend to be. He was known as a serious man and a fair one, a rancher who paid his hands honestly and treated the land with the kind of respect that comes from understanding yourself as a steward rather than an owner in the most absolute sense. He was known also as a council chairman who ran proceedings with efficiency and listened to every voice in the room, including and perhaps especially the ones that were easiest to dismiss. And he was known as Ruth Rourke's husband, which in Harlow Creek by 1897 was a descriptor that carried its own particular significance, because Ruth Rourke was a woman of such established and acknowledged stature in the community that being associated with her was a credential of genuine weight. Ruth, for her part, was aware of none of this as reputation, and all of it as simply the result of doing the things she believed in doing. She ran her dairy and her farm and her council seat and her household, and raised her children, and read her books and argued with her husband and loved him, and was loved, and found this entire configuration of her life to be more than she had known to hope for, and exactly as much as she had always known she deserved, which is a particular kind of contentment available only to people who have been honest with themselves about both halves of that equation. As the 20th century drew close, Harlow Creek was a different town than it had been in 1882, larger and more connected and more complicated, but still recognizably itself. The railroad spur had become a genuine economic artery. The school had produced 2 graduating classes of young people who went out into the world with more options than their parents had possessed. The water management systems that Ruth's cooperative had established had kept the farming operations on the eastern side viable through several dry years that would otherwise have been genuinely damaging. The council that Elijah chaired had, through the consistent application of something like wisdom, navigated the town's growth in a way that preserved what mattered about it while allowing it to become what it needed to be. On a December evening in 1899, the last December of the century, with snow falling outside in the slow, deliberate way of the best kind of snowfall, and the house full of the sounds of a family that had grown into its walls, Elijah found Ruth in the kitchen alone for once, standing at the window with a cup of tea in both hands, looking out at the snow falling on the yard, on the barn, on the long drive lined with cottonwoods that had grown considerably taller in the 17 years since she first came to this house as its mistress. He came and stood beside her, close, in the way they always stood when they were side by side and looked out at the same snow. Thomas was somewhere upstairs, probably reading, which he had discovered was nearly as interesting as horses and more portable. Eleanor was at the kitchen table behind them finishing a letter to Miss Clara Bright, who had moved to Cheyenne 3 years ago to teach in a larger school, and with whom Eleanor maintained a regular correspondence that was increasingly sophisticated on both sides. William, who was 2.5 and conducting a sustained campaign of investigation against every physical boundary in the house, was finally asleep, having exhausted himself and his parents in approximately equal measure through the afternoon. The house was warm and quiet and entirely itself. 17 years, Elijah said. 17 years next September, she said. He was quiet, looking at the snow. She looked at his reflection in the dark window glass, superimposed over the white falling outside. This man she had known for 17 years and loved for very nearly all of them, who had not diminished in any important way, and in many important ways had become more completely himself, more settled, more at ease, more present, as though the years had done the work that years do on a person who keeps faith with what matters. "I have been so lucky," he said, not with the inflection of someone counting blessings, but with the flat, honest tone of a man making a factual assessment. "We have both been lucky," Ruth said, "and we have both worked very hard. The luck and the work are not separate." He looked at her sideways in the window reflection. "Always correcting me," he said, and the warmth in his voice was something she could feel like heat. "Always," she agreed. He turned from the window and gathered her into his arms, and she let herself be gathered, tea still in hand, with the snow falling outside, and the children distributed through the house in their various states of sleep and wakefulness and activity. And she rested her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady and familiar, and exactly as she expected it to be. "Whatever the next century brings," he said into her hair. "We'll handle it," she said, "together." The snow fell on Harlow Creek through the night, covering everything in the particular mercy of winter, and inside the Double D Ranch house on the northwestern edge of a Wyoming town, surrounded by the life they had built together from something that had begun with a woman standing up in a town council meeting, and a man listening when she spoke. Ruth and Elijah Dalton stood in their warm kitchen as the last century turned into the next, and they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Percy Gaines lived to be 81 and was buried in the Harlow Creek Cemetery in the spring of 1903, with Ruth and Elijah and all 3 children at the graveside, and the Whitmore family, and the crew from the Double D, and more people than could reasonably have been expected, because Percy had been a fixture of the town for long enough that his presence was woven into it in a way that his absence made suddenly visible. Ruth said a few words over the grave with the clear, steady voice she had always had, and felt the specific grief of losing someone who had been there from the beginning, and Elijah stood beside her with his hand at the small of her back in the way he had when she needed solidity without fuss. And Thomas, who was 17 and becoming a young man of genuine substance, stood on her other side and did not look away from the grave. After they rode home together in the wagon, the whole family in the spring afternoon, with the mountains going blue against the sky and the cottonwoods along the drive in new leaf, and William, who was 6 and had not quite the age or the experience to fully comprehend what had happened, leaned against Ruth's arm and said, "Mama, will Percy be all right?" And Ruth said, with the simple honesty she brought to everything, "Percy did everything he was supposed to do, and he did it well, and yes, I think he will be all right." And William seemed to find this satisfactory, and the wagon carried them all home through the Wyoming spring. Thomas Dalton grew up to take over the Eastern Range management of the Double D in his 20s, with his father's judgment and his mother's directness, and he married a young schoolteacher from the new generation of the Harlow Creek school, a woman named Anna who had the particular quality of being exactly right for him in ways that made Elijah say to Ruth one evening that he thought Thomas had inherited his father's ability to recognize something genuine when he encountered it. Eleanor, focused and purposeful as she had always been, pursued her education beyond Harlow Creek to the considerable admiration and occasional alarm of the town, attending a teacher's college in Cheyenne and returning to Harlow Creek with a qualification that she applied first to the school and then to a broader ambition, which was to advocate for expanded educational opportunities across the county. She was a presence in public life in Wyoming into the next generation, and she had, Ruth thought, taken the best of both of them, her father's steadiness and her mother's willingness to stand up in a room and say what needed to be said. William, the youngest, grew into the person who surprised everyone the most, which was always the right of the youngest. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's hands, and a nature that was warmer and more social than either of his parents, a person who made friends effortlessly and remembered everyone's names and somehow always knew what was needed in a given moment. He became, in time, a physician, trained in Denver and returned to Harlow Creek because this was where his family was and where he understood himself to belong, and he served the community for decades, and he was very good at it. On a warm summer evening in 1910, when the century was 10 years old and the world was changing in ways both visible and not, Ruth and Elijah sat on the porch of the Double D, which was where they most liked to be at the end of a day, and watched the sun go down behind the mountains. They were both gray-haired now. Elijah's hair had gone almost entirely silver, which suited him in the way that silver sometimes suits dark wood, bringing out the grain rather than obscuring it. Ruth's copper hair had softened to something lighter, though the green of her eyes was unchanged, still capable of going summergrass soft or hard as flint, depending on the conversation. Thomas and Anna and their 2 children, a boy of 5 and a girl of 3, were inside the house with Mrs. Hadley, who was 70, and had declined all suggestions of retirement with a firmness that precluded further discussion. William was in town seeing patients, or at any rate that was where he was supposed to be. Eleanor had sent a letter from Cheyenne that had arrived that morning, characteristically precise and full of information about the legislative effort she was supporting regarding rural school funding. The ranch was full and alive and entirely itself, and the farm on the eastern edge of town was still running well under Walter Sims, who had been its manager for 15 years, and was now teaching a younger man the same skills that Percy Gaines had once taught him. The evening was warm and the mountains were doing the thing they did in summer, going purple and then blue and then dark against the long lingering sunset of a high-altitude latitude. "Elijah," Ruth said. "Ruth," he said. "What are you thinking about?" He was quiet for a moment, which meant he was being honest rather than expedient. "That town council meeting," he said, "October of 1882. She turned her head to look at him. He was looking at the mountains. "You think about it often," she said. "I think about who I was then," he said, and how close I came to not listening. I don't think I was a bad person, but I might have been the kind of person who thinks he already knows the shape of how things work. And you stood up and showed me that the shape was wrong, and I had enough of whatever it takes to actually see that. You had enough honesty, she said. You gave me something to be honest about, he said. She reached across and took his hand. We gave each other things, she said. That is the right way to remember it. He looked at her then, turning from the mountains, and she met his gaze in the warm evening light. And the look between them had accumulated 28 years of knowing each other, 27 years of marriage, and all the things that those years contained. The work and the difficulty and the children and the grief and the joy and the ordinary days that were the real fabric of a life. And it was, in the final accounting, everything. Yes, he said. That is the right way. The sun finished its descent behind the mountains, and the sky went deep and clear and full of stars. And on the porch of the Double D in the high country of Wyoming, Ruth Rourke Dalton and Elijah Dalton sat together in the dark and the warmth. And they were at the end of a long, full, extraordinary day, and also at the beginning of the one that was coming. And they were, as they had been since a woman stood up, and a man listened in a small church room on a Tuesday evening in October. Entirely and completely home.